Hello and welcome to the IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. The institutions that have shaped international cooperation for decades are facing unprecedented pressure, from geopolitical rivalry and the weakening of multilateral commitments to climate change to technological disruptions and global inequality. The question is no longer whether the world needs global governments, but what form it will take in the 21st century. In a recent paper, Global Governance in the 21st Century, Sustain, Reform and Transform, Professor Miles Kahler argues that the future of the international order will not simply be determined by the world's most powerful states. Instead, he explores how middle powers, regional organizations, and transnational networks may become increasingly important actors in sustaining and reshaping global cooperation. Professor Kahler, hello.
Hello.
Professor Kahler is a research professor in residence and distinguished professor emeritus at the School of International Service, American University. He is also a non-resident scholar in the Global Order and Institutions program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His research focuses on international institutions, global governments, international political economy, and the evolution of the international order. So, my first question is directly related to the paper. Your paper discusses three options: sustaining, reforming, or transforming global governments. When do you think small reforms are no longer enough? And is there a point when creating new institutions is better than fixing the existing ones?
That's a very important and difficult question at the very start. So let me say that incremental change clearly has been most likely in the past and is probably most likely in the future. Major changes in global governance in the past have occurred usually in the wake of major crises or wars. This is an argument made by John Eikenberry and others about World War II. You could make the same argument that the Concert of Europe order took place after the Napoleonic Wars. So we can hope there won't be such a crisis today to create such a new order. And it's more likely that we will have incremental changes over time. And in fact, many of the existing global institutions have reinvented themselves over time. The International Monetary Fund is not at all like the original design that was set forward at Bretton Woods at the end of World War II. So international institutions can reinvent themselves. More likely there's going to be incremental change. New institutions have been created recently by the challengers to the existing order, or those who are dissatisfied with the existing order, particularly China. So China has created the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, just two examples. We have various BRICS institutions. So new institutions have been created, but they have been very much partial and limited, not global in their orientation, and typically created by those who are dissatisfied with the existing orders. So you ask a normative question as well. When will the new institution, entirely new institution, become preferable to repairing existing ones? And that's a difficult question as well. I mean, at the moment, we have a patchwork, and there's been a patchwork for some time in global governance. Some institutions have been successful. Some have been much less successful, obviously. And I define successful in two ways: effectiveness, on the one hand, in fulfilling the mandates of its members, and legitimate in terms of being viewed as, and this is linked to effectiveness, of course, being viewed as legitimate by their members, as having authority that is legitimate in the eyes of its members. Getting those two things to come together is very, very difficult. And it seems to me that we have a mixed picture at the moment, with some institutions that have been more successful at reinvention and maintaining their effectiveness and their legitimacy, being global and inclusive, and others that have been less effective in that regard.
You also place a considerable impact on middle powers. And on one hand, I understand the argument, but on the other hand, there is sort of a strategic autonomy. It comes from the middle powers. They want own space, on geopolitical space. So when we join these together or compare these together, how optimistic are you that they can become architects of a new order rather than a simply hedging between major powers?
Well, in the paper, and this is still my view, the middle powers are important. They have become much more active recently, but I'm not totally optimistic about the middle powers as system sustainers or supporters or innovators. There are two groups of middle powers, as I point out in the paper. There are those that are aligned with the United States or have historically been aligned with the United States, the members of the G7, Australia, South Korea, and they are dependent on the United States for its security guarantees still. They have definitely demonstrated that they are unhappy, many of them with the United States, most notably with Mark Carney's address at the Global Economic Forum, arguing for more middle power initiative, more middle power support for global governance. They're definitely much more active, particularly in trade and forging various arrangements in trade to circumvent some of the actions by the United States in terms of trade protectionism. Whether that group of middle powers, those who are aligned with the United States, if you will, those from the global north, can actually create or move towards some sort of new global order, I think is dependent dependent largely on whether they can deal with their security dependence on the United States. And this is particularly true for Europe, but it's also true for the allies of the United States in the Pacific. So if they want to move forward in a way that doesn't include the United States, and that might run counter to some of the interests of the United States, that security dependence is a substantial obstacle. The second group of middle powers are rather different, and I've already touched on those. Those are the BRICS, or what I call the new influentials. These are middle income and upper middle income large emerging economies. They are much more likely to challenge the existing order, at least rhetorically, but I don't see them as espousing overturning that order, and I don't see them particularly as advancing new models for a coherent alternative global order at this point. They are sort of radical reformers in rhetoric, and they claim greater influence in the existing order. But their difficulty is not their relationship with the United States, because typically they have not been aligned or allied formally with the United States. Rather, they have divergent interests within their group. For example, on UN Security Council reform, where India and Brazil would like to be permanent members of the Security Council, but that is not acceptable to China. And this is epitomized during the current Iran war, where the BRICS group, which is recently expanded, could not come up with a coherent position on the war because the group included both Iran and the UAE, who are on opposite sides of that conflict. The middle powers, it seems to me, will only become motors and innovators in global governance if these two groups can forge agreements across the divide, the north-south divide, if you will, and also if they can collaborate with the EU, which is a major economic power that is too often left out of our conversations, but it seems to me is critical for any sustaining reforming of the existing global order or creating some sort of new order out of this existing patchwork. The other big issue is, will the United States and China permit such initiatives to take place if they are perceived as running counter to their own interests? And they certainly have leverage over these two groups that I already mentioned. Security guarantees for the first group of middle powers, economic leverage over both groups of middle powers. And as you mentioned, you could see what they're doing now, the middle powers, as hedging between these two. And indeed, if they want to take independent initiatives on their own, they have to be concerned about whether those will be viewed as hostile moves or moves that China and the United States would not want to take place, and whether the United States and China have the leverage to prevent them from taking place. So that's another set of issues that is out there. They're not acting in an environment that is absent the major powers, China and the United States. They have their own interests, and they are likely to take a position on some of these initiatives being taken by the middle powers.
The other question is consensus-based multilateralism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is interesting because everyone speaks about multilateral institutions, but we don't speak a lot about consensus, about decision-making process within those institutions. So what's your take on that? And would you support moving towards more sort of variable geometry institutions in which participation and obligations differ across the states?
Well, it's certainly true that consensus-based decision-making is typical of many of the legacy global institutions, even institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that have weighted voting and typically legally can take decisions on a majority vote basis. In fact, they do not in practice. Typically, they take consensus decisions. They do everything they can at the executive board of the IMF and in the World Bank as well to reach a consensus if possible. Now, they do have the possibility, if consensus cannot be reached, of taking decisions on a more majority voting basis, but that is rarely the case, I would say. And in other cases, like the World Trade Organization, consensus decision making is the norm. And as the recent history of the WTO demonstrates, the World Trade Organization, that can serve to impede effective decision making because there can be a blocking by an individual country or a small group of members when the majority, maybe an overwhelming majority, would like to move forward. And that has been a big problem for the World Trade Organization recently. So you definitely see a move toward plurilateralism, as it's called. In other words, in certain cases, within global institutions, in some cases outside global institutions, small groups of countries moving forward with initiatives, with reforms, with policy changes that they want to take place that would be blocked if they were in a more inclusive global decision-making setting that is governed by consensus. So I think Carney's speech on the middle, advocating this sort of activity on the part of middle powers was exactly that, and pointing toward plurilateralism among groups of countries that share common interests and common values. And I think that probably will be the future going forward. Now, there have been recent cases where groups of countries, fairly large groups of countries, have reached consensus without the major powers, without the United States and or China. The U.S. boycotted the G20 summit in South Africa in 2025, and there was still an outcome from that summit. There was a decision by the leaders that was published. The UN Climate Change Conference, COP30, was also viewed with hostility by the United States. Then, when that could not reach a consensus, you saw exactly what you were pointing to. A smaller group of countries, but still a fairly large group of countries, went to Colombia, to Santa Marta, to meet on the question of whether the world should move toward a transition away from fossil fuels, something that could not be agreed upon at COP30. And they did reach a consensus. But that also suggests some of the shortcomings of plurilateral or smaller group decision-making, in that none of the major greenhouse gas emitters, US, China, and India, were present at Santa Marta. So you have a consensus, but you need to include those who actually will make the decision meaningful, and they were absent. So you have, once again, the challenge of effectiveness, small groups being much more effective, plurilateralism being more effective, versus legitimacy, which usually means more inclusion, making sure that all voices are heard, and especially the inclusion of those who are essential to the desired outcome, whether they contribute resources, which is true of the United States and often China, or because their national policies are critical to the outcome that you want to reach. So if the United States is not present, China is not present, and you're dealing with climate change, then probably the outcome is going to be less than effective.
I think in some way we might say that there is a certain minilateralism within multilateralism. So I think this is quite interesting because, as you said, those smaller states or middle powers, they try to group together. So
yes.
Psychologically, it's also a good argument that we are presenting a proposal and we are behind it as one single state is behind it. So I think that's a quite interesting development in global governments as well.
Well, these smaller groups have existed for a long time. In many ways, the groups that we talk about today, the G7, even before that, the G10 in international monetary affairs, were created back in the 1960s and 1970s. So uh, these clubs, if you will, these smaller groups, were often created because in those cases, a group of industrialized countries wanted to make decisions that they felt would be more effective and more suitable to their interests at a time when the global institutions were expanding their membership very rapidly because of decolonization. So you then begin to get the start of the industrialized country clubs, which are still with us today, and other clubs have taken shape over time. Once again, because of either effectiveness or a desire to get outcomes that might not be reached in the larger group, not always because of the barrier of consensus decision making.
We already mentioned BRICS and BRICS countries. You argue that the BRICS countries have not yet demonstrated a coherent global leadership. And I know that there are many reasons for that, but from your perspective as a scholar who is researching global governments, what's the major issues that those countries are facing and why they are not able to get more coherent on a global stage?
Well, um, there are several reasons for that, I think. I mean, one is that the global south, which is a term that even I'm willing to use, but I think doesn't represent a coherent group based on interests. If you look at what we call the global south, China likes to present itself as a leader of the global south, but in fact, China's interests do not converge with, for example, many poor developing countries on trade issues. A recent paper from the Peterson Institute in Washington pointed out that China's reluctance to move up the manufacturing value chain and allow poorer developing countries to enter manufacturing, as had been the case in the past, is really a barrier to their economic development. China is someone that's monopolizing the entire manufacturing value chain. So, for example, in that case, also with highly indebted countries, many of the poor indebted countries are indebted to China. China is a creditor country. And yes, it's a member, it can portray itself as a member of the global south, but in many ways, its interests are much more similar to the other creditor countries, which are members of the so called global north. So it's not really a coherent group. The BRICS group in particular, which was a smallish group originally when it was founded in 2009 to 2010, has now chosen to expand its membership, which means it's going to be more difficult. So, in other words, it's moving counter to what we discussed earlier, moving away from a minilateral focus to a plurilateral focus with more members. And as I already pointed out, in the current war, the current Iran war, they have completely divergent interests. They're on opposite sides of the war, and the BRICS group was not able to present a coherent perspective. So there's an issue of just convergent and divergent interest because of economic development. And I think that's the interesting point. China has moved far ahead of most of the other BRICS countries in terms of its economic development. It is a much larger economy now than Brazil, India, and South Africa, and much less Russia. And that makes its interests, even within the smaller BRICS group, very different and maybe divergent from some of those countries. So there's so many conflicting interests there. It would be very difficult for any one larger group of global South countries to present a coherent view on global leadership or global governance. But I would argue also there's a principal barrier in their domestic demands. And this has been true since the formation of the BRICS group. A claim for leadership in global governance requires attention from the leadership and resources. And all of these countries, quite legitimately, have very large domestic demands on their resources. And that means it's going to be very difficult for them to devote the kinds of resources, public resources in particular, that would be required for them to exercise leadership in many of the global institutions. Now, China clearly has been picking up more on the resource side of things, but it's still not at the point where in certain areas like humanitarian assistance, it is playing the kind of role that the global north countries, the European countries, Japan, the United States have played in the past. So I would once again, qualify what I've just said, not to be too pessimistic, all of these countries can contribute ideas. They can contribute innovation. They contribute voice. The small island countries have been very influential as a group within climate change negotiations. We have various initiatives in financial and monetary affairs, like the Bridgetown Initiative. The ideas can come from anywhere. And I don't want to make it seem as if the countries from, whether we call them emerging economies, global south, have been completely without influence or without innovative ideas in the past. They certainly have been. Eric Helleiner has pointed out at the Bretton Woods conference that it were not for the developing countries who are present there, development would not have been on the agenda in the way that it was, and the creation of the World Bank would have looked very different. You have the Latin American countries and their contributions to the dialogues on human rights and non-intervention going back to the 20th century, early 20th century. So once again, ideas, impetus, the motor for change can come from anywhere, and it's not always linked to power. And it doesn't always mean you have to have a coherent group to put forward those ideas. But at the moment, I would have to say, if we're looking for a coherent alternative to the existing order, that has not come from the BRICS countries yet. And most of their concerns have been, as new influentials, making a claim for greater influence on the existing order. And it's not an order that they wish to overturn, because it's an order that, on balance, has been very successful for them economically and socially.
I have one question that I must ask, because my friend told me to do so, a scholar from Latin America. And he told me, ask if the reason why joining the BRICS, it's not because they want to agree with everything, but because they have no choice. Like, there is no certain alternative to BRICS for the global South countries. So it's better to join BRICS, even if, let's say, 40% or 30% is something the country doesn't agree on, but at least there is 60% the country can sort of pursue through BRICS in some way. What do you think about this?
Well, it's fair enough. I mean, absolutely, you join any international or regional organization. You will not agree on everything necessarily. I do think the expansion of the BRICS, though, once again, for this reason we've been discussing throughout, expansion makes agreement. The 60% starts to drop to 50% or 40%, right? The more members you get, the more unlikely it is you will come up with a coherent position. But the other question is, what does the BRICS represent? You know, is it simply a challenger organization, an organization that is out there to say, we do not like the existing order, we don't like everything about the existing order, we want to reform it in some way, some specific way? And the BRICS meetings always come out with communiques which have specific requests, specific suggestions. But there are many other places where there are groups of developing countries, non-G7 countries, non-North countries, that can make their case within the IMF and the World Bank. There are groups that put forward their agendas over time. So it's not as if the BRICS are the only place that a Latin American or another country can make this statement. And the question is, why would you choose the BRICS over some other grouping? And it's clear that some countries have chosen not to apply to become members of the BRICS, partly because they see it as being seen as hostile to or challenging the Europeans, the United States, the Canadians, the industrialized countries as a group. There's also an awkward issue with the BRICS with Russia, especially since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. How do you deal with the Russia issue? And that has become a difficult issue for the BRICS countries, I think. And it's even a difficult problem for the G20, where many of the BRICS members belong. So yes, you could say this is the group to belong to if you want to make a point or to advance a program. But there are many alternatives out there for developing countries, including regional institutions, which we haven't discussed. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is exclusively, non-Northern countries, if you will, although Singapore is quite rich and is a member, but still, it's basically a group of developing countries that have been quite successful in many metrics. So regional organizations are another way that one could put forward a collective point of view. And I have to say, compared to Southeast Asia, Latin America in that regard has been somewhat disappointing in terms of especially its economic regional organizations, as compared to the hope that surrounded organizations like Mercosur in the 1990s. It seems to me regional economic integration in Latin America has not advanced as much as one might have hoped, nor has there been the kind of collective, presence that one can see with ASEAN in Southeast Asia. But anyway, we could talk further about regional organizations if you like.
Latin American voice hasn't been heard so much, and especially in the European Union, where there is a close connection because of language, Spanish and Portuguese, we still didn't achieve any significant progress since the older structures, I would say.
Well, in the Latin American case, once again, to bring back the question of domestic political demands, I think one of the issues in Latin America, which experts in the region, which I am not, have pointed to, is the political polarization in the region. So you have, very conservative governments, which are now taking power in countries like Colombia and Chile, and you have more populist or left of center governments in countries like Brazil at the current time. And even further left in the case of Venezuela at one time, though not anymore, presumably, that made it very difficult to come up with a coherent regional organization. These swings in politics make it more difficult. Now, ASEAN regionally has gotten around that problem, of course, because many of its countries are not democratic, or they have fairly coherent elites that share the same economic view, which is basically outward looking and welcoming of foreign investment and the like. So I think that's another issue for any region. And you can see that, as you've already mentioned, in Europe, where there has been there was a divide, which was quite stark. Now that Hungary has had its election, the divide within Europe is pretty less stark than it once was. But, once again, a couple of countries that are not in line with the broader consensus, or the consensus is so watered down that it becomes almost meaningless. It can be a real problem. And that's often a domestic political issue.
Yes, and recently when we were approving the latest sanction package for Russia, we saw the consensus was conditioned by some requests of interest from certain countries, for instance, Greece. So there is always something that the consensus must go through. And it's, as we say, something for something.
Yes, and even more right now for China. The effort to build a coherent counter to China economically is even more fraught, because there are countries that want to welcome Chinese investment. There are countries that have big stakes in China in terms of trade and investment. And that creates a very difficult problem for creating a coherent policy toward China. Although I might add, the United States has had the same problem. So having a coherent position toward China, given its economic interdependence with so many countries around the world and the leverage that it exerts around so many countries, is a very difficult problem. So the European Union is not alone in that regard.
Let's turn the page, and I'd like to discuss sphere of influence as a concept. If I understood the article correctly, you sort of reject the sphere of influence as a long-term solution. But can we speak about sphere of influence transforming themselves? So we have geopolitical sphere of influence, but we might have chips manufacturing sphere of influence or raw materials sphere of influence. So how do you see this concept from your research perspective?
Well, you're right. I have typically defined spheres of influence in the kind of classical way, which it seems to me there are two elements in the sphere of influence. One is hierarchy within it. So there is a dominant power that exercises influence over subordinate powers in some sense. And that can be over just their foreign policy, or it could be over their domestic politics and political alignment as well. And then the second feature, typically in the past, was excluding other powers from that sphere. So the Monroe Doctrine was a classic example of that by a very weak country, the United States, but saying essentially, we are not going to allow European countries, in its original formulation, we're not going to allow European countries to recolonize South America, Latin America. So that's the classic kind of view. And you could argue that the Soviet bloc was that sort of sphere of influence, certainly a very, imperial, verging toward the imperial end of the sphere of influence, certainly, and even perhaps beyond sphere of influence in that regard, a very, very rigid hierarchy and a very exclusionary policy toward other powers. Now, you point to something which a number of analysts have brought up recently, which is, can you construct economic spheres that are really mainly economic, and even within particular sectors like global value chains in manufacturing of various items or various defense-related products that are of concern. Maybe in AI, which we may get to later. That's another area where you could see China and the United States trying to construct those sorts of spheres. That's a possibility, and you can certainly see both the Trump administration and China moving in that direction to a degree, trying to, in some of the trade agreements I mentioned in my paper, the United States has imposed on in their bilateral trade negotiations clauses which are an attempt to keep China out. And there's a recent paper from the Peterson Institute in Washington, which points to the fact that many of the trade agreements that the United States has been making bilaterally under the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, have either clear or implicit motivations of keeping China out or keeping the country in question from doing particular types of arrangements with China. These are called sometimes poison pills, but in other words, that really does constrain a country's policy in a way that does start to resemble or echo a sphere of influence. And I think you're right in pointing to that possibility. Now, the question is, can the United States and China enforce such efforts? And that's where in the paper I was skeptical about classical spheres of influence. And I think I would remain skeptical even of these kinds of spheres of influence. Because the value of having relations with both the United States and China is so high that being willing to exclude one or the other for many of the countries, particularly middle-income developing countries, even more industrialized countries, is going to be very, very difficult unless they see their economic security in the same way. And then we're not talking about a sphere of influence, we're just seeing convergent interests, right? So it could be that one of these countries also sees China as a potential threat and therefore aligns itself with the United States on chips manufacturing, for example, or critical minerals. But that need not be the case. And more typically, they're going to want, as you mentioned in an earlier question, they want to hedge their bets. They're going to keep the future open to possible relationships with both the United States and China. So even if these sorts of things are embedded in trade agreements or other types of agreements, I still would be relatively skeptical about enforcement over time. What can the United States and China actually do to keep these countries in line in these little, what we call mini spheres?
When I read your paper, I found it not a descriptive one, just saying what it is, but it prompted me to think about the future and the future directions regarding the global governments. And you argue that the future coalitions may be organized around both interest and values. And when we have a multipolar world, we have this setup of the global governments. The question is naturally emerging, who is going to defend values and who is going to guard interest? Because there are so many sort of like implications. For instance, in the EU, there are sanctions against Russia on one hand, but on the other hand, Russian LNG is very welcome in the EU. And since the war, the EU invested so much in this energy stream. So people might ask how the values and interests are going to coexist or function in the future.
Well, that is the big question in many ways, and I think it's an issue for some of the questions we've already discussed. For example, middle powers. When Mark Carney talks about these smaller groups of countries getting together to put forward particular programs to defend the liberal order, what have you. Is he talking about, he mentioned interests and values. Which is it going to be? I mean, the easiest is countries that share both your interests and your values. That used to be the bedrock of the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Europe. That is now in question under the second Trump administration, I think. So there will be some difficult decisions, and there have already been difficult decisions. For example, the relationship between Europe or the United States or Canada, for that matter, with the Gulf states, which are autocratic, not liberal political regimes, violators of human rights, and yet very important economically, and actually probably endorse a basically liberal view of the international order because they benefit so much, especially from the financial order. So, here they share in some sense, for reasons of interest, maybe even values, economic liberalism of a sort. But on other issues of liberalism, political, human rights, the way you order your domestic political regime, they don't. And the world is likely to be like that for the future. And it has been like that for a very long time, it seems to me. I mean, during the Cold War, certainly, there are all kinds of very difficult bargains being made with regimes that did not share a liberal view of the world or the liberal view of the global order, but they were not part of the Soviet bloc. And therefore, the United States and Europe made deals with them. Thinking about Franco Spain, for example, before the end of the Franco regime, which was part of the U.S. basing system and very controversial when that relationship was shut up, because he had been neutral during World War II, but basically kind of on the fascist side, certainly in the Civil War in Spain. So there have been these compromises. The question is, what will the order look like? And can you have a liberal order if the United States is not behaving in a liberal fashion or is not acting to support the liberal order? And certainly right now, one could have to say the United States is not, by and large. Human rights is essentially off the US agenda for all intents and purposes. Many aspects of the liberal order, such as liberalizing trade, are off the agenda for the United States. So can we still have a liberal order if that continues to be the case? I think the United States, first point would be the United States has always endorsed a very particular variant of liberalism. Right? It always had a strong religious component for the United States. The United States always seemed willing to intervene in other countries' political affairs much more than others would argue a liberal power should. The United States was very selective in trade, even during the period when it was liberalizing trade. It was selective, like most countries, in terms of how much it endorsed the liberal order. In fact, we've never had a completely free trade order. We've always had a liberalizing order that had many escape clauses and many ways to maintain a certain degree of protectionism for domestic political purposes. So it's always been an imperfect order, but I think it was basically the norms that governed the order were basically liberal. And I think that's still possible because I think in the past, it wasn't totally dependent on the United States, which, as I mentioned, had its own variant of liberalism, which often was not shared by others. And I would argue at the present time, it's the European Union that represents the core supporter of liberal values, along with Canada, Australia, and other industrialized countries, and many countries in the global south rather than the United States. Can they keep the liberal order going? I think that's an interesting question. What concerns me the most, and I mentioned this in the paper, is one very fundamental norm, which is in the United Nations Charter. Political autonomy and territorial integrity are now being challenged, not only by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but by statements by the United States that it wants to take over Greenland. So if the major powers are not going to accept that very fundamental norm, then we have a big problem. I mean, the political autonomy part has always been qualified because the United States, Russia, and other countries have intervened in the affairs of other states. But the territorial integrity norm is very, very important, and it has been a foundation of the post-1945 order. That's how we have so many sovereign states, right? That can feel secure within their own borders to a considerable degree. If that fundamental liberal norm is going to be challenged, especially by the major powers, then we have a serious issue for the liberal order. But I think the support for the liberal order was always broader than the United States, and the United States was always an uncertain supporter of the liberal order in many ways. And give one final example, the International Criminal Court, which many would regard as the epitome of, liberal values because it makes individuals responsible for crimes, international crimes. Well, the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and under the Trump administration, it's quite hostile to, and has made it clear it wants to dismantle the International Criminal Court. So, yet many other countries in the world are members of the court, support it, support its decisions, and presumably it will carry on that basis.
Do you think that a liberal order in the current sort of way needs upgrade because of what's going on? I spoke with some international scholars, and they told me that in some way they see their research going nowhere because they are researching something and then someone decides, oh, we're just going to do the thing. And it's completely ruined the whole idea of the principle of this international law. So in some way, they are asking me, do we need a new liberal order, sort of liberal order after the switch to more multipolar world? Because the current way is this country is doing that, then the second country is doing completely different thing, but the both countries are members of the United Nations. And this creates sort of like a rupture.
Well, I think you raised the question that's always raised about international law and international legal orders is how many violations does it take before there isn't any law, right? If no one obeys the traffic laws and they're just driving any way they want on the street, then is there a law at all, right? We just total disregard for it. I don't think we've gotten to that point. I do think the United States is much more reluctant to invoke international law than it used to, and this is where the support of major powers is very important, because even if if a country violates international law and it invokes international law at the same time, then that says something that the legal order still exists in some sense. You can be hypocritical and still be a member of the legal order. In fact, your hypocrisy demonstrates that the legal order exists. It's when countries begin to say, well, I don't recognize this norm or this law at all, that we have a problem. Now you can see, for example, the law of the sea. The United States has not signed on to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, even though the United States Navy has advocated for it for a long time. The United States Congress and administrations have not put it forward. But the United States has said it respects most of the Convention of the Law of the Sea and regards it as part of international law. Now, China has been, and its actions in the South China Sea, there's been an arbitration tribunal that have found against China in the South China Sea, and China has basically said, we don't care. So there you have another major power saying in a very important sense that we're just going to disregard this. We're disregarding the tribunal. China's not saying it's disregarding the law of the sea, but it's saying the tribunal doesn't have the right to adjudicate in this regard. And I think the major powers have often done this, and other powers have done this as well. On the other hand, I think there's still a substrate, if you will, of international law, which countries take very seriously, law of the sea being one. Countries do respect exclusive economic zones. They understand what the territorial waters are. And that is all established by international law and has been for some time. So I think, once again, there are certain areas of international law which are quite fundamental and would be, I think most countries regard it to be very damaging to their interests if they started to fragment or fall apart. And there are other parts of international law, more recent perhaps, especially in the area of human rights, where countries are more willing to take a pass or to look for an escape clause or to argue that we didn't sign this convention and therefore it doesn't apply to us. But even there, I think there's substantial evidence from political scientists and others that these conventions have had an effect on state behavior. You know, that, for example, torture is less common now than it once was, partly because of the International Convention Against Torture. And so there are ways in which international law has influenced behavior and continues to influence behavior and have become, in some sense, embedded in national behavior. And that's very likely to be overturned because there is a domestic constituency for obeying international law. Once again, partly because of normative attachments, human rights groups, for example, but also because businesses, for example, would be very uneasy if many of the economic aspects of international law were overturned. So there's an interest side to this as well.
I have one follow-up question, because I think we should touch it in some way. And that's the opinion about building strong regional law based on the multipolarity. So when I have, for instance, the Caspian region or Black Sea region with a particular norms and laws, which anyway are embedded in global international law anyway, because it just adjusted to particular region. What's your opinion about this system of thinking? And is there any sort of maybe improvement or a better way how to do it based on your research?
That's a very interesting question, and I cannot claim to be expert on that. It seems to me regions, I mean, the European Union is so unique in this regard in developing its own legal order with its own court of justice. Now, there are other courts around the world, quite a few of them, which Karen Alter and other scholars have researched, many of them dealing with human rights issues. So there are regional bodies of law that are developing or have developed over time. How they would then feed into the larger global legal order is not clear to me. I honestly don't know. It seems to me they could be a useful field for innovation that could then later be developed in international law at the global level. But it's clear there's a fair amount of activity going on there, at least in the terms of the regional courts over time. And they have continued to develop, which once again reflects back on your question about the future of international law. You know, if countries didn't believe in a legal order of some kind, why are they establishing courts? You know, because they're establishing courts to adjudicate issues in which there are clear rules, presumably, that need to be adjudicated. And that's true pretty much across regions, as far as I know. Although Asia, less than other regions. It's interesting. But certainly for Africa, Latin America, Europe is the kind of paragon of this. These regional orders are certainly developing, and regional courts have become quite significant actors. Some of them more in economic issues, and some of them also in areas like human rights. But once again, I don't claim any great expertise on this. It's an interesting question of how they could feed into the global legal order.
I was, before the recording, I spoke with a few colleagues, and they told me that they see sort of movement to strengthen regional rules, laws, and norms, because in some way they want to protect own region. As they see, you know, the movement of the major powers like Russia, United States, China. So they're trying to shape it in a way that it's not against them, but also it's like sort of a warning finger, like, look, this is our region. Don't do what you want here, because people living here in some conditions and some way, and we want to preserve that region. So this was behind the question I asked.
Well, I think that's an interesting possibility going forward. If the major powers continue on their current path, which is not particularly friendly to many weaker powers, collective action at the regional level is clearly one way to go. The problem, as I point out in the paper, is that the regional organizations outside of Europe are really quite weak. They don't have much delegated authority. They don't have much institutional heft, if you will. And that makes it difficult. Even ASEAN, which is a quite significant regional organization, if you look at its actual institutionalization, it's fairly thin. You know, there are many agreements, but the organization itself It's not like the European Union, the head of the European Commission, as a figure who has to be included in negotiations by right. You don't see that in the case of other regional organizations, unfortunately. And as I mentioned before, Latin America even less than ASEAN.
And I think, just briefly touching what you said, there is a certain element of scholars and think tanks, because, for instance, in the West, the United States or European Union, you have so many papers, you have so many institutes, and people are speaking about questions, sometimes good questions, sometimes bad questions, but they are speaking and speaking a lot. But when you go to ASEAN, or when you go to different regions, South Africa, for instance, you can't find that many papers, and the discussion is sort of limited. So I think if the discussion was greater and more intense, I think that would also contribute to better clarification and articulation of the interests of particular regions. That's my humble opinion based on the conversations I had.
You're absolutely right. And one of the reasons, when we're going back to our earlier discussion of the BRICS group, and the middle income, if you will, or emerging economies, and can they create coherent positions, whether regional or otherwise, you need not only resources in the terms of aid and other soft power resources, but resources in the sense of knowledge creation, right? And Europe, much more even than North America, has an incredible infrastructure of individuals, scholars, policymakers, retired policymakers who are constantly thinking about and promoting different ideas and innovations in this area. Some of them will never be implemented, some of them will be, but in fact, the thinking is going on. And those resources simply do not exist in the same level, I think, in many of the other regions. Here, I would say Latin America and Asia probably more than Africa, but they exist. They're very credible. They're very high quality in many cases, but there are just fewer of them.
Let's turn the page and let's speak about our favorite topic recently, and that's artificial intelligence. I know that this discussion has many dimensions, because we just witnessed what China did, sort of artificial intelligence global governance initiative, and it was greatly presented as an initiative coming from the East, and they asked countries to join it. And I think artificial intelligence is in some way, it's erasing the barriers. And through that, we have the notion that artificial intelligence is in hands of few companies. But those few companies were able to shape the whole world. Consequently, the question is, what's your opinion about the influence of artificial intelligence on the global governments? And what can you see? What sort of implications? Maybe you see some interesting notions that you might mention.
Well, I'm afraid I suffer from the same thing that the individuals who are much more expert on this issue than I suffer from, which is it's moving so fast. This particular technology, as compared to other technologies like the internet, or you can go back, computing, that is very difficult to keep track of even what's going on, even if one is an expert. But I think you pointed to one very fundamentally difficult or different issue with artificial intelligence, which is the enormous influence of private corporations. This is all being driven in the private sector in the United States and to a limited degree in Europe. But in China, of course, it's being driven by a sort of private sector, but one that is very state directed. And in any case, it's taking place in many ways, even in China, outside the purview or the surveillance of the state. So how politicians or political actors can intervene even to govern this sector domestically or internationally, globally, is a very complicated issue. There is a deep asymmetry of information, is the technical term. In other words, all the information about what is happening in artificial intelligence is in the hands of private actors, essentially, or the actors within these AI corporations, whether they're in China or the United States. And political actors, whether it's the U.S. Congress or the European Union or even the Chinese government, I suspect, are a bit in the dark about, because they don't know what's going on. It's hard to say what they should do or how they should regulate. And really, it comes down to an issue of regulation, as it does in most economic spheres. Should there be regulation? And what is the trade-off between regulation and innovation? And of course, the private actors, at least in the United States, although there's a big divide, as I understand it, within the private actors in the United States about the level of risk and the level of regulation that is desirable. But generally speaking, private actors prefer self-regulation. Trust us, don't worry about it. We will innovate, you will benefit. And I think the political actors now, certainly in the United States and increasingly elsewhere, are saying, we're not sure we trust you, and we are concerned about the risks, and we will pay the price if the risks are too high. And there is and this is, the pessimists say that the concern is there will be a major incident of some kind in which artificial intelligence goes off the rails and creates a very, very big negative outcome of some kind. And then there will probably be an overreaction and efforts to control it if that's possible. So I think the governance issues could be similar to other governance issues like trade or climate and others, where it's a question of how do we regulate to produce certain global goods or national goods, public goods that we want created in the face of private actors who are acting according to their own interests, which may or may not produce that outcome that we want. And the difficulty is, in those other cases, it's much more transparent what's going on in the sectors. You can see what's happening in trade. Well, sort of. I mean, there are ways around even trade protectionism, of course. But in the case of artificial intelligence, the lack of information among public sector actors, of credible information, and the need to trust completely on what private sector actors are telling them is a very, very difficult challenge. That's very different from, I think, previous global governance issues. I mean, the self-regulation versus public regulation, that, where that divide should be, has always been an issue. It's certainly true in the financial area, which I have studied more. The private actors have always preferred self-regulation to a considerable degree, not exclusively, but that's similar. But I think our knowledge about the technology is changing very rapidly. Our knowledge about the risks, our knowledge about what is actually going on in terms of that technology as it develops very rapidly is unique compared to other technologies and other economic sectors in the past.
Follow-up question. Do you think that we need to change formulations of some treaties, saying that, for instance, your artificial intelligence won't launch nuclear weapons against my country?
Well, there's a whole side of artificial intelligence where, once again, I am hardly expert, that touches on defense. Autonomous weapon systems, for example, and the human rights community has been concerned about this for some time. And I think there are efforts underway to develop norms and guidelines and even international rules about the use of artificial intelligence in the international security and defense sectors. Frankly, I would have to say I'm fairly skeptical of whether that can happen, because once again, the technology is moving quickly and no country wants to be left behind or left vulnerable to these sorts of constraints on their behavior or on their use of this technology, which many of them don't fully understand. They believe it is going to fundamentally change the way defense and war fighting is undertaken in the future. So, defense people tend to think that nothing is safe, and therefore we should always hedge against every risk. And the risk they worry about is the adversary having AI or using AI in a way that we cannot. And I think that's where things break down. There's already been a divide within the United States between the Trump Defense Department and one of the AI companies, Anthropic, about this issue and what they could use AI for.
My little remark would be that who knows what they have? Because usually, if you have a private company, firstly, you release the product that it's tested, safe, and people can buy, people can pay for it. But behind the scenes, there are people working on the second and the third generation of the same product already. So I think we know maybe 20% of what's going on, because as a taxpayer you can't say, look, I am American citizen, can I visit the company and have a look? Nobody will open the door for you. So I think
Right.
this also opens more questions. In your
Mhm.
paper, you mention the importance of the domestic politics regarding
Mhm.
international order. So I would
Mhm.
like to speak about this notion. Does this imply that the scholars of global governments have devoted too much attention to international institutions and too little to comparative politics?
Generally, yes. I think generally that's true of international relations in general, though we've had some excellent scholarship more recently by scholars like Elizabeth Saunders and Susan Hyde and um, others about the comparative politics of foreign policy, which is a very important part of this. And I cite them in the paper. I think their work has been absolutely fundamental in trying to understand how domestic political change necessarily affects global governance, particularly when it takes place in the major powers, but not exclusively. So clearly, international trends, as I point out, toward autocracy or backsliding democracy, points to major issues for international collaboration among the major powers and for global governance in general. And it's not just the United States, Russia, China, but also Turkey, India, the Gulf states, and so on. So when you start to have major players who have these regime types, unconstrained power, centralized power in many cases, that creates big difficulties, many difficulties for international collaboration of trust, unpredictable behavior, which is certainly a characteristic of the Trump administration. How do you forge? And here we're not talking about some normative, pie in the sky thing. We're just talking about if you make a bargain with someone, how do you know that they will keep the bargain? Um, and if the political situation is such that it's all in the hands of a single individual or a very small group of individuals who are advising that individual, and that can change from day to day, how can you forge collaboration in any realistic way when you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow? This is a problem not only for other governments, it's a problem for private business. This is where for example, the trade policies of the Trump administration have been extremely complicated for especially small businesses in the United States and elsewhere because they cannot contend with the uncertainty and the unpredictability in the way that larger companies and larger corporations can. Now, I point out in the paper, I do think, despite these political changes, the major powers can still avoid the worst and have an interest in avoiding the worst, probably. So, nuclear conflict at the top of the list, perhaps climate change, perhaps the risks associated with artificial intelligence. We don't know whether there will be guidelines and backstops between the United States and China. There have been talk of that, but whether that will happen is not clear. But there's a possibility if we're cooperating at that minimal level, certainly, to avoid the worst possible outcomes. But I also state at the end that for really significant improvements in global governance and collective leadership among the major powers, that will require regime change. And by that, I don't mean violent change or overturning political systems, but a change in the complex of policies, particularly very nationalistic and unilateral policies that are being pursued by these major powers. Until that changes, they're not going to be major positive influences on cooperative relationships in global governance, probably. And at worst, they will be disruptive and trying to overturn and meddle and do other things, as we've discussed earlier, with those who are trying to promote cooperative relationships, collaborative relationships of certain kinds. And I'm not the only person arguing this. I would point you to a recent publication by Adam Posen, who's president of the Peterson Institute, International Economics in Washington, which is a very prominent and excellent mainstream economic think tank. And at the end of his publication, which came out just a few weeks ago, he mentions when someone, he says, well, what would reassure the rest of the world about the United States? he says it would be a true realignment election in the United States, and here I'm quoting from his piece, meaning the electoral wipeout and replacement of the current MAGA Trump version of the Republican Party by one committed to rule of law rather than nationalist nostalgia. So that is, that's what I mean by regime change. It means, certainly a very substantial political change, but a change in a kind of policy dynamic, a policy complex, which is driving this unilateralist nationalist position in the United States, in China under Xi Jinping, in Russia certainly under Putin, and in other countries like Turkey, Erdogan in Turkey, and elsewhere. And that's why I mentioned also at the end of the paper that really there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the domestic and even local level to rebuild, collaborative, cooperative, liberal global governance. It's not just a global question that governments do up there. It is something that people have to work at domestically in their neighborhoods, if you will, but certainly at the national level.
The last question for today's interview. As a professor emeritus and established scholar, I would like to ask a question about the research. What do you consider as under-researched area or areas in global governance scholarship? And that would be sort of piece of advice for the junior researchers that might put the energy and enthusiasm into researching such a topic.
Well, certainly on my current agenda, and I think it should be, and it's now becoming much more of an agenda among younger scholars that I know, and I hope they continue in that line, is to look at what I call complex governance, which is, I think, where the interesting features of global governance, we haven't talked about them a lot today, but the non-state actors of various kinds. We did talk about private corporations, but also there are NGOs, obviously, there are foundations, there are a whole array of actors who are collaborating to a degree under the radar, though they're getting much more attention than they used to get. If you look at an area like global health, we have, a formal organization, the World Health Organization, which is not insignificant or unimportant, but it is surrounded by a whole host of other actors, the Gates Foundation, various developing country governments, various NGOs, and those are the actors that are moving global health forward in many ways, although they are also connected to national governments and to the WHO. So I think looking at this extremely complex and complicated system of governance that we have and where it is moving and how it moves is really a fascinating area to research, but a very difficult one because there are so many actors and just keeping getting a sense of what the landscape is an extremely descriptive issue, a descriptive problem, quite apart from researching why they act the way they do, what kind of cooperative arrangements they construct, and what effect this has on global governance. And it may not all be positive. There are those who have a very negative, not negative, but a skeptical view of these new actors and what they have done in global governance because it can lead to a considerable degree of fragmentation, less effective governance, concerns about legitimacy because many of these groups are based in the global north, and so on. So lots of interesting questions there. But I would say I'm a fan of the global institutions, the formal global institutions, but that's not where all the action is today by far. And I think looking at these other areas we've talked about, whether it's complex governance, non-state actors, regional institutions outside of the European Union and where they are heading, all of these are very interesting and very much important parts of global governance research. One final word for the younger scholars is it seems like a bleak time for global governance. It seems that this is not where things are moving, but I would say don't give up. The world will, as you mentioned at the outset, the world will be governed one way or another, and it's just a question of how it will be governed and whether we like the way it will be governed in the future. So,
Professor Kahler, many thanks for sharing your research insights,
sure,
your comments, your remarks about the fascinating topic of global governance. It's such a complex topic and it requires sort of holistic overview before I start to research because it's a huge topic and there are many areas.
Yes.
Of course, we can't cover all of them during 60 minutes, but I'm very thankful for your time and for your knowledge that you were willing to share, and also that little message for the junior researchers, which I think it's always very nice to hear from someone as established as yourself.
Thank you. And thank you for a very, very interesting and intellectually challenging conversation.
Professor Kahler, many thanks for being on the IR Thinker.
Thank you.